She was 54 years old, arriving on a train she hadn't booked, carrying a trunk she'd packed in grief. And someone had hung a tag on it that read, "Worthless." Not on the trunk, on her. The man who sent her here thought that one word would destroy everything. He was wrong. If you've ever been counted out before you even got started, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The train came in 12 minutes late, which was normal for the big timber line in late September. The platform crowd had already started thinning by the time the whistle sounded across the valley. A few merchants waiting on dry goods, a boy from the telegraph office, two women from the church auxiliary who had no real business there but showed up anyway, the way people in small towns always did when a train was due. Wyatt Granger stood at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low and his hands shoved into his coat pockets. He wasn't watching the horizon the way most men watched for a train. He was looking at the ground, working through a mental inventory he'd already run twice that morning. 60 yards of cedar post fencing, 30-pound rolls of barbed wire, salt blocks, maybe a second-hand stock tank if the freight price came in low enough. He'd sent the order 3 weeks ago. The reply from the supply house in Billings had confirmed it. The train was supposed to be carrying the first materials that would let him begin closing the north pasture before the first freeze hit. He needed that fence. The calves were drifting. The pasture was open on two sides, and the older steers had figured that out. The locomotive groaned to a stop. Steam rolled across the boards in low, white waves. A freight handler dropped the ramp, and a teenage boy jumped off first. Then a man in a wool overcoat carrying a leather satchel. Then a woman Wyatt didn't recognize. Tall, straight-backed, somewhere in her mid-50s, wearing a traveling dress that had been fine once and was still kept carefully. She carried a small bag over one arm. Behind her, a porter wrestled a single weathered trunk onto the platform and set it down harder than he needed to. Wyatt wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was looking for the freight car. "Mr. Granger." He turned. The woman was standing 10 feet away, looking directly at him. She had gray-streaked hair pinned up under a modest hat, a strong jaw, and eyes that were doing what eyes do when a person is in an unfamiliar place and working very hard not to show it. "Yes," he said. "Margaret Ellison." She didn't extend her hand. "I believe I was sent here to—" She stopped, started again. "I was told this was an arrangement, a marriage arrangement, through the Billings agency." Wyatt stared at her. "I don't—" He pulled his hands out of his pockets. "Ma'am, I didn't place any order with a marriage agency. I placed a supply order, fencing material, from Billings." Something moved across her face. It wasn't quite embarrassment, it was something older and quieter than that. The look of a person who has already absorbed too many surprises to flinch at one more. "I see," she said. Behind her, two men from the church auxiliary's husbands had drifted closer. One of them, Frank Holt, who ran the feed store and had opinions about everything, leaned toward the other and said something low. The other man laughed. Wyatt saw that. He also saw, for the first time, the tag tied to the handle of the woman's trunk. Brown paper, looped through with string. He couldn't read it from where he stood. He took 2 steps forward and read it. "Worthless." Written in clean block letters. Not stamped. Written by hand, deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing. He looked at Margaret Ellison. She was looking at the tag too. She had clearly seen it. Possibly she had seen it for the entire duration of the train ride from Billings, which was 4 hours. "Who sent you?" he said. "The agency told me the arrangement came through a third party." She said it evenly. "They didn't give a name." Frank Holt was close enough now that Wyatt could hear him without straining. 50 years old if she's a day," Holt said. Somebody's idea of a joke, sending that out to a ranch. Wyatt's luck keeps getting better. The woman beside Holt covered her mouth with her hand. Not from sympathy. Wyatt reached down and untied the tag from the trunk handle. He folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't look back at Holt. "The next train east leaves Thursday morning," he said to Margaret. "If you want to be on it, I'll see that you have a place to stay in town until then, and the fare is covered." He paused. "Or you can ride out with me and take a look at the ranch before you make any decision. Either way, the choice is yours." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, more like someone running through a calculation they hadn't expected to be making today. Around them, the platform crowd had stopped pretending not to watch. Margaret Ellison looked once at the people standing there, the women with their hands folded, Frank Holt with his arms crossed, the freight handler who had stopped moving boxes. And then she looked back at Wyatt. "I'll ride with you," she said. Wyatt's wagon was a working wagon, not a comfortable one. The bench seat had a crack down the middle of it that had been repaired with a strip of leather nailed down flat, and the boards were warped enough from weather that sitting on the left side meant sitting slightly lower than the right. He didn't apologize for it. He'd stopped apologizing for things at some point in the last 2 years because the list of things to apologize for had gotten too long. They rode north out of Big Timber without much conversation. The road climbed slowly through scrub brush and yellowed grass, the mountains sitting distant and blue at the edge of the sky. Wyatt kept his eyes on the horses. After about 20 minutes, Margaret said, "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years? Cattle operation? Yes. How many head? He glanced at her. Why? Because you're worried about fencing, which means you have animals getting where they shouldn't. I'm trying to understand what kind of operation I'd be looking at. He thought about that. 83 head, down from 112 last spring. She didn't say anything to that. She just nodded once, like she was filing it. "You know cattle?" he said. "My late husband and I ran a small operation in Wyoming for 22 years. She said it without sentiment, just as a fact. "We sold it after he passed. I didn't want to run it alone, and his brother wanted to buy it, so that seemed like the sensible thing." "How long ago?" 3 years? Wyatt didn't ask anything else. He'd been around enough people who'd lost things to know when someone had already said as much as they intended to on a subject. North Ridge sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges, which is where it got the name, though the logic of calling a place after the ridge to the north when there was an equally prominent ridge to the south had always mildly bothered him. The house was solid, a 4-room structure built from local timber, chinked and weathered, but not failing. The barn was larger than the house, which was the correct priority for a working ranch. There were 2 outbuildings, a smokehouse that was barely used, and a bunkhouse where his 3 hands lived. Those 3 men were sitting on the bunkhouse steps when the wagon pulled in. Dolan was the oldest, somewhere around 40, with a face that looked like it had been left outside too long. He'd been with Wyatt for 6 years. Next to him was Pete, who was 26 and quick with horses and slow with everything else. The third was a younger man called Ellis, who'd shown up in spring looking for work and had stayed because Wyatt hadn't gotten around to telling him not to. All 3 of them looked at Margaret the way you'd look at something unexpected. Not quite rude, but not hiding the surprise either. "Boys," Wyatt said, climbing down from the wagon, "this is Margaret Ellison. She'll be staying for a few days." Dolan stood up slowly. "She the, He stopped himself. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Pete said nothing. Ellis said howdy and looked at his boots. Wyatt carried Margaret's trunk inside and set it in the spare room, which had a cot and a window that faced east and a small table that wobbled. He'd meant to fix the table for 2 years. "It's not much," he said. "It's fine," she said. He showed her where the water pump was, where the privy was, where the kitchen kept its supplies. She followed him through it without complaint or comment, taking in the layout of things with the same quiet attention she'd used on the wagon. That evening, after supper, which Wyatt cooked himself and which was adequate but not good, Margaret asked if she could take a walk out to the pasture before dark. "What for?" "I'd like to see the herd." He shrugged. "Suit yourself." She went out alone. He watched from the kitchen window as she walked to the fence line and stood there for a long time, just looking. Chad. The next morning she was up before he was. He came out to the kitchen and found her at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing something. A cup of coffee sat near her elbow. She'd found the stove and figured it out without asking. "What's that?" he said. She looked up. "Observations from yesterday evening." She turned the paper toward him. He sat down and looked at it. She'd written in a clear, compact hand a list of notes about the herd, pasture rotation, the condition of specific animals she'd noticed, a question about the feeding schedule. A note about one section of fence near the creek that appeared compromised before the north section he'd been focused on. You got all that in one evening? Some things are easier to see when you're not the one who's been looking at them every day, she said. You stop seeing things after a while, not because you're careless, just because they become normal. Wyatt looked at the paper again. The note about the feeding schedule was right. He'd known something was off there, but hadn't been able to put a finger on what. The creek fence, he said. I didn't know that was going. The ground's soft there. The posts have heaved. 2 of them are barely holding. She picked up her coffee. If you get a hard freeze before you get to it, you'll be chasing cattle out of the creek bottom. He folded the paper and set it down. The fencing supplies I was expecting on yesterday's train didn't come. I noticed there was no freight delivered, she said. What happened? I don't know yet. Which was true, and which was the part that sat uneasily with him, because he had a feeling, the kind of feeling you get when things go wrong in a pattern, that it wasn't an accident. Caleb Rourke owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had for 15 years, and the way he'd built it was not a story that reflected well on him. Wyatt knew this the way everyone in the valley knew it, not from evidence they could take to a judge, but from the kind of knowledge that accumulates over time when you watch how a man operates. Rourke bought up struggling operations, underbid legitimate competitors, pressured supply houses to give him preferential terms, and passed the costs on to smaller ranchers. He had money and patience, and a talent for making other people's bad luck worse at exactly the right moment. Wyatt had refused to sell twice. He suspected that was why his supply order had gone missing. He went into town that afternoon and sent a wire to the supply house in Billings. The reply came back in 2 hours. The order had been canceled. The cancellation had come from a Billings broker named Aldous, who worked, as Wyatt knew, as a middleman for Rourke's purchasing operation. He sat in the telegraph office for a moment with the paper in his hand. When he came back to the ranch, Margaret was in the far pasture with Dolan, walking the fence line. Dolan was 3 steps behind her with his hands in his pockets and an expression that suggested he'd been corrected about something and wasn't sure yet how to feel about it. She found 2 more posts that need replacing, Dolan said when Wyatt reached them. He said it without inflection, which with Dolan meant he was either impressed or annoyed. Hard to tell. She's right, Wyatt said. Pull them and reset them. Dolan walked off. Margaret was looking out at the herd where a group of younger calves had bunched near the water trough. You separate the weak ones from that bunch? Wyatt asked. I asked Dolan to move 3 of them this morning. 2 are being crowded out at feeding time and losing weight because of it. The 3rd one has something going on with its front leg. Not broken, but strained. It needs a few weeks without competition at the trough. She paused. I hope that wasn't out of line. No, Wyatt said. That was the right call. She turned and looked at him. What happened with your supplies? He told her. Rourke's name didn't need explaining. She'd grown up in this part of the territory and knew the shape of the man even if she didn't know him personally. He sent me here, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what I think. She was quiet for a moment. He chose me specifically because he thought a woman my age would be... What? A burden? A joke? Probably both. She nodded slowly. Not hurt, exactly. Something harder than hurt. He doesn't know very many women, she said. Wyatt almost smiled. Probably not the right ones. Come on. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned on. Margaret worked. That was the simplest way to describe it. She wasn't performing usefulness. She wasn't trying to prove anything to Dolan or Pete or L. Ellis or Wyatt or anyone else on the platform who'd laughed. She worked the way people work when work is what they know, because it is what fills the hours, and the hours need filling, and standing around waiting for someone to tell you your value is a waste of time. The calves she'd separated began gaining weight within a week. The rotation she'd suggested for the east pasture gave the grass room to recover in ways Wyatt hadn't managed in 2 seasons. The feeding schedule she'd revised meant the older animals weren't pushing the younger ones aside at trough time, which was a small thing that turned out to matter more than any of them had expected. Dolan stopped saying things under his breath by the end of the first week. Pete started watching what she did with the calves and asking questions by the end of the second. Ellis, who had less pride than the other two and therefore less to set aside, simply started following her around like a puppy on the third day and hadn't stopped. One evening, Wyatt came in from the barn late and found her at the kitchen table again with her paper and pencil. She did this every evening, sat and wrote out what she'd observed, what she'd done, what needed doing next. It was the most organized anyone had been about the ranch since Wyatt's wife had kept the books, before she left 4 years ago. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long and sat down across from her. "You haven't mentioned Thursday," he said. She looked up. "Thursday?" "The train. The one going east." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you want me on it?" "That's not what I asked." She set her pencil down. "The ranch has 3 things working against it right now," she said. "The supply problem Rourke created, the condition of the north pasture fence, and the fact that your herd's average weight at market is going to come in low if nothing changes in the next few weeks." She picked up her pencil again. "I'm not on that train Thursday." Wyatt drank his bad coffee and said nothing. Outside, the wind was starting to move off the mountain, which meant the temperature would drop before morning. He'd need to check on the strained calf in the east pen. "I'll check the east pen," Margaret said, like she'd heard him thinking. She capped her ink and stood up and put on her coat. He watched her go out into the dark, and he thought about the tag he'd folded into his coat pocket on the train platform. Still there, he hadn't thrown it away. He wasn't sure why. And he thought that whoever had written on it had made the same mistake that men like Caleb Rourke always made, which was assuming that a person's worth was something you could measure at a glance, on a platform, in the 30 seconds it took for a train to stop and a woman to step off it. The wind pushed against the door. He got up and put another log on the fire. The East Pen calf pulled through. That was the first thing Wyatt noticed when he came out at first light. Margaret was already there, crouched beside the animal with one hand on its flank, watching the way it put weight on the leg, not favoring it quite so much as the day before. She had a tin of salve she'd mixed herself from supplies in the tack room, something her husband had taught her years ago, and she'd been applying it every morning and evening without being asked and without mentioning it. "Better," she said, not looking up. "Yeah," Wyatt agreed. He stood there a moment watching the calf, which was a brown and white thing with a broad face and the general expression of an animal that had no idea anyone was invested in its recovery. Then he went to feed the horses, and Margaret went back to her notes, and the morning started the way mornings on a working ranch start, which is to say without ceremony and without waiting for anyone to be ready for it. What changed in the 3rd week was Dolan, not dramatically. Dolan wasn't a man who did anything dramatically, including change his mind, but Wyatt noticed it. He came out of the barn one afternoon and found Dolan standing beside Margaret at the water trough, both of them looking at a calf that had been struggling to gain weight since summer. Dolan had his hat in his hands, which he only did when he was actually paying attention to something. "She says it's the teeth," Dolan said when Wyatt walked up. "The back molars on the left side aren't coming in right," Margaret said. "It's not getting full value from its feed. It eats, but it can't chew properly, so it's essentially malnourished even though it's taking in enough volume." She glanced at Dolan. "You seen that before?" "Once," Dolan said. "Long time ago. Different outfit." He turned the hat over in his hands. "Didn't know what it was then." "Most people don't. It's easy to mistake for something else." Dolan nodded at that. It was the nod of a man filing something away that he intended to keep. Wyatt went back to what he'd been doing. He didn't say anything about it. Some things were better left to find their own level. The supply problem, on the other hand, was not finding its own level. Without the cedar posts and wire from Billings, the north pasture fence remained a gap in the operation that Wyatt couldn't close. He'd sent 2 more wires to 2 other supply houses and gotten back polite non-answers that weren't quite refusals. "Just delays, pending stock, we'll see what we can do." It had Rourke's fingerprints on it. The man owned favors all over this part of Montana, and he was calling them in. Wyatt came back from town on a Wednesday afternoon with nothing useful and a headache that had started behind his left eye and wasn't improving. He tied the horse and sat on the porch steps for a minute before going inside, which was something he almost never did. He was not by nature a man who sat. Margaret came around the corner of the house from the direction of the garden. She'd found the neglected kitchen garden behind the house and had started doing something with it, which Wyatt hadn't asked about and didn't intend to question, and stopped when she saw his face. "No luck," she said. "No." She sat down on the step beside him, not too close. "What about lumber? Rough-cut posts instead of milled cedar?" "There's a mill 20 miles north, Henderson's." Would Rourke have reached there? Wyatt thought about it. Henderson's a stubborn man. Doesn't like being told what to do by anyone. Might not. Then it's worth a ride. Might be. He rubbed his face. "It's not just the fence. He's working on the buyers now. I got word from a man in town that 2 of the outfits who bought from me last year have been—" He paused, looking for the right word. "Encouraged to look elsewhere this season." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The auction's when?" 5 weeks. She nodded. "Then we have 5 weeks to make the herd worth buying, regardless of what Rourke says about it." He looked at her. "You think that's possible?" "I think the calves that were struggling a month ago are putting on weight now. I think the pasture rotation has given the grass time to come back on the east side. I think if we get the fence material from Henderson and close that north gap, we stop losing ground every time the wind shifts." She brushed some dirt from her hands that she'd picked up in the garden. "I think Caleb Rourke has spent so long assuming everyone around him will fold that he's forgotten what it looks like when they don't." Wyatt looked out at the pasture. The mountains were turning orange in the late light, and the herd was moving in that slow, aimless way cattle move in the evening when nothing's bothering them. "He sent you here to break something," Wyatt said. "I know." "Does that bother you?" She considered that honestly, which he'd come to understand was the only way she considered anything. "It did on the train," she said. "When I saw the tag, I sat with that for about an hour." She paused. "Then I decided that a man who thought that was a weapon didn't deserve the amount of energy it would take to stay angry at him." Wyatt almost said something. He didn't. "You should ride to Henderson's tomorrow," she said, and stood up and went inside. He rode to Henderson's the next morning. Margaret was right about the man. He was stubborn and didn't like being told what to do, and had in fact been approached by one of Rourke's brokers the previous month and told it would be in his interest to limit his dealings with smaller ranches in the valley. He'd told the broker where he could go, in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The price for rough-cut posts was higher than cedar from Billings. Wyatt paid it. He didn't have the luxury of looking for a better deal. He came back with the first load himself, and Pete and Ellis made 2 more trips over the following 3 days. By the end of that week, they had enough material to close the north gap and reinforce the section along the creek that Margaret had flagged in her first night's notes. Dolan ran the fence crew. He was methodical about it, which was the right quality for that kind of work. Margaret went out with them on the second day, not to supervise, just to see how the terrain sat when you walked it, versus when you looked at it from the pasture. She came back and told Wyatt there was a low spot near the northwest corner that would collect snowmelt come spring and undermine posts if they weren't set deep enough there. Dolan reset 3 posts without being asked twice. Pete, who had been the quietest of the 3 hands about all of this, finally said something on the 4th day of fence work. He said it to Ellis, but loudly enough that it wasn't private. "She knows what she's doing." That was all he said. Ellis said yeah, because Ellis agreed with most things. Dolan said nothing, but later that week he started saving her the better end of the bench at supper, the side that didn't catch the draft from the window, and he did it without comment and in a way that suggested he would have found it embarrassing if anyone pointed it out. What nobody at Northridge knew yet was that Caleb Rourke had heard about the fence. He had ears in enough places that information found its way to him without him having to go looking for it. Henderson's mill was one of those places. Not Henderson himself, who told his broker off, but a man who worked the Henderson yard and supplemented his wages by passing along what he saw. Rourke heard that Wyatt Granger had bought rough-cut posts and was closing the north pasture. He heard that the Ellison woman was still at the ranch, that she hadn't taken the Thursday train or any train after it. He heard that the calves were looking better. He sat with this information in his study for an evening and concluded that the situation required adjustment, The supply pressure had failed. The woman he'd sent hadn't created the disruption he'd intended. He needed to come at this differently, and he needed to do it before the big timber auction, because if Wyatt Granger's herd sold well at auction, he'd have enough to carry the ranch through winter and into next year, and possibly to recapitalize, and then Rourke would be back where he'd started, watching a man refuse to sell on a piece of land that Rourke had been working toward for going on 3 years. He called in a man named Stills, who handled certain arrangements for him, and they had a conversation in the study that neither of them wrote down. Chums. Wyatt didn't know about Rourke's conversation with Stills. What he knew was that the ranch was running better than it had in 2 years, and that he was not sure what to do with that, or with the woman who was largely responsible for it. He'd lived alone, functionally alone. The hands were there, but that was different, for 4 years. He'd gotten used to the particular shape of his own company, the way you get used to a room that's missing furniture. You arrange yourself around the space where the thing used to be, and eventually the arrangement starts to feel normal. Margaret didn't disrupt that exactly. She wasn't noisy, and she didn't take up more room than she needed. But her presence changed the quality of the silence in the house, and sometimes in the evenings when they were both at the kitchen table, her with her notes, him with the account books, he'd look up and find himself momentarily surprised that someone else was there. Not unpleasantly, just surprised. One evening she asked him about his wife, not intrusively, just the way people sometimes ask about things when they've been around each other long enough that the question doesn't feel like prying. Clara, he said. She left 4 years ago, couldn't take the winters anymore, or the uncertainty. He looked at the ledger in front of him. Both were fair complaints. Where did she go? Her sister's place in Oregon. We write sometimes. Margaret nodded. She didn't offer sympathy, which he appreciated. Sympathy for that particular situation always felt slightly wrong, like the problem was that something had been lost, when really the problem was more complicated than that. My husband's name was Robert, she said. He died of a fever in February, which is a terrible time to die because winter feels like it's going to last forever anyway, and then it also takes someone. I'm sorry. We had 22 years, she said. That's not nothing. No. She went back to her notes. He went back to the ledger. The fire crackled and the wind moved against the walls of the house, and outside the horses were quiet in the barn. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was something. Found. The trouble came on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the auction. Wyatt was out at the north fence with Ellis, checking the newly set posts, when he heard Pete shouting from the direction of the east pasture. Not calling out. Shouting, the way you shout when something is wrong and you need someone now. He ran. What he found when he got to the east pasture took him a moment to understand, because the mind sometimes resists information that means a large amount of work. The fence on the eastern border, not the section they'd been focused on, but the established fence that had been there for years, was down. Not falling down. Down, sections of it, 3 separate gaps across a stretch of maybe 200 yards, posts pulled, wire cut or dragged aside. Cattle were already out. Not all of them, but enough. He could see them scattered across the open ground beyond the fence, drifting in multiple directions the way cattle do when they've found a gap, which is without any particular urgency and in a way that covers the maximum possible area in the minimum amount of time. When? He said. I don't know. Pete's voice was tight. I was up here an hour ago. I didn't... He stopped. Maybe the hour before that. I don't know exactly. Margaret came up the slope from the house at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground quickly. She took in the fence and the scattered cattle with one long look. How many out? She said. 30, maybe 35, Wyatt said. She turned to Pete. Catch up your horse. Go wide around the left side and push them toward the creek. Don't try to turn them all at once. Just hold the left flank. She turned to Ellis. Same on the right. Don't push hard. Just keep them from spreading further. Both men moved. Neither of them looked at Wyatt for confirmation. They just went. Wyatt caught his own horse. Margaret was already on hers. She'd ridden out with Dolan the day before to check the new posts and hadn't unsaddled yet, which turned out to matter. The fence didn't fail, she said when he came up beside her. Those posts didn't heave out of the ground. They were pulled. I know. Rourke. Most likely his man Stills. I've heard the name. She looked at him squarely. This is going to get worse before the auction. Yeah. Then we need every animal back inside before dark. They rode. It took 4 hours. The cattle had not gone far in any organized sense, but cattle are not organized animals, and the concept of going somewhere specific is foreign to them. So retrieving 34 head from open ground with 4 riders and the sun dropping steadily in the sky was an exercise in patience and managed frustration. 2 of the calves that had been gaining weight, the ones Margaret had been tracking most carefully, had worked their way into a stand of brush near the creek and were not inclined to come out. Margaret went in after them herself, pushing her horse through brush that grabbed at her coat and snapped back, talking to the animals in a low, steady voice that had no particular magic to it except that it didn't alarm them. Dolan, who had come out when he heard the commotion, watched her bring both calves out of that brush and said to Wyatt, "That's a hell of a woman." Wyatt didn't answer. He was counting heads. By the time the last animal was back inside and the gaps in the fence were temporarily closed with rope and pulled wire, proper repair would take another day. It was past dark and all 5 of them were tired in the particular way you get tired when you've been moving fast for hours with stakes high enough to keep you from noticing the exhaustion until it stops. They ate supper late. Nobody talked much. Margaret's hair had come half down from its pins, and she had a scratch across the back of one hand from the brush, and she ate her food without remarking on either of these things. Afterward, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark pasture. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No. He's going to try something else before the auction. Probably." She turned around. Her face in the lamplight was tired, but the tiredness wasn't in her eyes. Her eyes were doing what they'd been doing since the moment she stepped off the train. Watching, calculating, deciding. "Then we need to think about what's coming instead of just reacting to it," she said. "We need to be somewhere he can't reach us." Wyatt looked at her. "The auction," he said. "The auction," she agreed. "Whatever he's going to do, he'll want to do it there, in public, where he can make it stick." She paused. "So we make sure we arrive at that auction with animals nobody can argue with. Whatever he says about you, about me, about this ranch, the cattle answer for themselves." Wyatt thought about the calves, the ones that had been struggling in September, that were moving differently now, standing differently, holding weight they hadn't been able to hold before. He thought about the east pasture grass that was coming back in the rotation Margaret had laid out. He thought about Dolan resetting 3 fence posts without being told twice. 5 weeks ago," he said slowly, "I wasn't sure I had a herd worth taking to auction." Margaret looked at him. "And now?" He didn't answer right away. He went to the window and looked out at the same dark pasture she'd been watching, where the cattle were settled and quiet in the way animals settle when they feel safe and don't know they've just been through something. "Now," he said, "I think we've got something worth fighting for." She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face relaxed, just slightly, in the way a person's face relaxes when they've been carrying something tense for a long time, and someone finally says the thing they've been waiting to hear someone say. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountain again. Wyatt added wood to the fire without being asked, and Margaret sat back down at the table with her pencil, and the lamp burned steadily against the dark, and somewhere in the pasture a calf bawled once and then went quiet. The fence repair took most of the next day. Dolan ran it like he ran everything, methodically, without wasted motion, pulling the damaged sections and resetting posts in a sequence that made sense only if you'd been doing that kind of work long enough to see the whole picture before you started. Pete and Ellis worked beside him without needing much direction. Margaret walked the full length of the damaged stretch in the morning and marked 2 additional spots where the wire had been stressed but not broken, places where another visit from Stills, or whoever Rourke had sent, would find easy purchase. She marked them with strips of cloth tied to the top wire so Dolan would know where to reinforce. Wyatt spent the morning in town. He went to see a man named Calloway, who had been a county land assessor for 20 years and knew the legal landscape of the valley the way ranchers knew their own pastures. Not a lawyer exactly, but close enough for the kind of conversation Wyatt needed to have. He laid out what he knew: the canceled supply order routed through Rourke's broker, the fence damage, the pressure on buyers. And Calloway listened with his fingers laced together on his desk and his face doing the careful, neutral thing that men do when they're absorbing information they find genuinely concerning. "Can you prove any of it?" Calloway asked when Wyatt finished. "The supply cancellation, maybe. The Billings house would have records. The fence?" He shook his head. "No witnesses." "Stills doesn't leave witnesses," Calloway said. "That's what Rourke pays him for." He unlaced his fingers and leaned back in his chair. "What you have is a pattern, Wyatt. Patterns are useful in conversation. They're harder in a courtroom." "I'm not thinking about a courtroom." "Then what are you thinking about?" "The auction," Wyatt said. "I'm thinking about what he does at the auction." Calloway nodded slowly. "He'll come after the herd's credibility. That's what's left to him now. He can't stop you from showing up, can't stop you from selling if the buyers want to buy. What he can do is stand up in front of everyone and say, the cattle aren't worth what you're asking. And if enough people believe him or are afraid enough of him to act like they believe him," he spread his hands. "A man with Rourke's standing can move a crowd at auction without saying anything that's technically a lie." Wyatt sat with that. "What if someone else said something first?" Calloway tilted his head. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone who could speak to what actually happened. With the agency. With the woman he sent." He looked at Calloway. "Rourke didn't do that himself. He went through the agency. Someone at that agency knows what was arranged and why." Calloway was quiet for a long moment. "The agency in Billings?" "Yes." "You'd need someone from inside to be willing to say it publicly. At the auction, in front of buyers in half the county." He paused. "That's not a small ask." "No," Wyatt agreed. "It's not." He rode back to North Ridge in the early afternoon with the particular feeling of a man who has identified a path that exists but isn't sure yet whether it's passable. Margaret was in the barn when he got back, doing something to one of the older steers that involved a close examination of its coat and a tin of something that smelled medicinal. The steer was tolerating it with the stoic resignation that large animals develop when they've learned that fighting the smaller creature is more trouble than it's worth. "There's a woman at the Billings agency," Wyatt said from the barn doorway. "Or was, a clerk named Vera Sundstrom. She handled correspondence for the agency for years. She processed whatever arrangement Rourke made to send you here." Margaret didn't look up from the steer. "And you want her to come to the auction and say so?" "I want to find out if she would." "Do you know her?" "I know her brother. He runs freight out of Livingston." He leaned against the doorframe. "I thought I'd wire him tonight, see if he can get word to her." Margaret finished what she was doing and put the lid back on the tin. The steer shook its head once and went back to ignoring both of them. She turned around and looked at Wyatt with an expression that was considering something she wasn't sure she wanted to say. "You don't have to do that," she said finally. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the auction is about the cattle. The cattle will speak for themselves. You don't need to make it about me, about what he did." "He made it about you," Wyatt said. "The day he put that tag on your trunk." She held his gaze for a moment. "I don't need people feeling sorry for me, Wyatt. That's not what this is." He pushed off the doorframe. "This is about making sure every buyer in that yard knows who they're dealing with when they deal with Rourke. It's not about sympathy. It's about information." He paused. "And it's about him not getting away with it." She looked at him for another moment, and something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened, slightly, the way a door opens when a latch you didn't know was engaged finally gives. "Wire the brother," she said, and went back to work. "What?" The wire went out that evening. The reply came 2 days later, which was faster than Wyatt had expected. Vera Sundstrom was no longer working at the agency. She had left 3 months ago, according to her brother's wire, under circumstances that the brother described as not her choosing. She was in Billings, staying with family, and she had been, in the brother's words, looking for an occasion to say what she knows. Wyatt read the wire twice. Then he went and found Margaret. She read it once. "She was pushed out," she said. "That's my guess. Either she made noise about what happened with the arrangement, or Rourke's people got to the agency ownership. Either way, she has her own reasons to talk." "Yes." Margaret handed the wire back. Then we invite her. Bartem. The 2 weeks before the auction moved the way time moves when there's too much to do and not enough of it. Too fast in the days and too slow at night. Wyatt and the hands worked the herd steadily, not pushing them, but keeping them moving and fed and managed in the way that shows in an animal's condition at market. Margaret revised the feeding rotation twice more as the weather shifted, compensating for the drop in temperature that came in the second week of October and settled in like a house guest who hadn't been asked to leave. The calves were, by any honest measure, better than they'd been in September. The 3 that had been struggling worst were now indistinguishable in movement and weight from the animals that had been healthy all along. The steer Margaret had been treating in the barn came through whatever had been wrong with him and rejoined the main herd with no lasting evidence of the problem. Dolan, who did not give compliments, said to Wyatt one evening that the herd was coming in better than he'd expected. Dolan's scale of compliments ran from silence at one end to not bad at the other, with better than expected representing something close to its outer limit. Vera Sundstrom arrived on the Wednesday train, 4 days before the auction. She was a small woman in her late 40s with quick eyes and the particular manner of someone who has been carrying a secret they're tired of keeping. Wyatt met her at the station, the same station where Margaret had arrived 6 weeks earlier, and brought her out to the ranch in the wagon, which was still uncomfortable, the leather patch on the bench seat still nailed flat. Vera and Margaret sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours that evening while Wyatt worked in the barn and the hands played cards in the bunkhouse. He didn't know exactly what was said. He knew that when he came in for coffee around 9 o'clock, both women were still at the table and the conversation was not the tentative kind. Later, after Vera had been shown to the spare room, Margaret came and stood in the kitchen doorway where Wyatt was banking the fire for the night. "She has documents," Margaret said. He looked up. "What kind?" "Correspondence. Between Rourke's broker and the agency. Written instructions about the arrangement." She paused. "He specified the age range. He specified that the woman sent should be one unlikely to be accepted. He wanted someone who would be, his word, in the letter, useless." Wyatt stood up from the fire. "She kept copies," Margaret said. "She made copies before she left the agency because she had a feeling she'd need them." He stood there for a moment taking that in. "That's more than pattern evidence." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is. The night before the auction, nobody slept particularly well. Wyatt was up at 3 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table in the dark without lighting the lamp, just sitting with the silence and the sound of the wind and the particular quality of dread that comes the night before something that matters and cannot be undone once it starts. He'd been at enough auctions to know how they worked, the way a crowd could turn on information, the way reputation moved through buyers like weather. He knew what Rourke was capable of in a public setting. The man was polished and convincing and knew exactly how to make doubt feel like common sense. He heard footsteps, and then Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway in her coat, which she'd pulled on over her nightclothes. "Can't sleep either," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." She lit the lamp and put the kettle on. She sat down across from him, and they didn't say much for a while, which was a thing Wyatt had noticed about her. She didn't fill silence just to fill it. She let it exist until something worth saying came along. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about it. "Not the way I thought I'd be." She folded her hands on the table. "On the train, coming here, I was scared. I didn't know where I was going or what I'd find. I had one trunk and $42 and a name on a piece of paper." She paused. "Now I know what I'm walking into. That's different. Known things are easier to stand in front of. Rourke's going to go after you directly, in front of everyone. I know. He's going to say things." "He's been saying things since before I got here," she said. "He put it in writing." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. "That was a mistake." The kettle began to make noise. She got up and made 2 cups of coffee, the same way she'd done that first morning, finding the stove, figuring it out, not asking. She set one in front of him and sat back down. "Wyatt," she said. He looked up. "Whatever happens tomorrow, the ranch is in better shape than it was 6 weeks ago. That's real. Nobody can argue the cattle out of the condition they're in." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Whatever Rourke says, the animals are there. They're standing in front of people. Weight and health are not opinions. He looked at his coffee. I know. Then hold on to that. Ocean. They drove the herd into Big Timber at first light with all four hands, Wyatt and Margaret riding alongside. It was cold the way October in Montana is cold. Not brutal yet, but with a seriousness to it, a reminder that it could get worse and would. The cattle moved well on the road, which was a thing that told you something about their condition. A struggling herd moves badly, bunches wrong, stops and starts. This one moved with a kind of settled steadiness. Dolan rode up beside Wyatt on the main road into town. He looked at the herd for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "They look good." He said it the way someone says a true thing they've been holding on to until they were sure of it. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "She did that," Dolan said. "We did it." Dolan glanced at him. "Sure," he said, in a tone that suggested he was agreeing without agreeing. The Big Timber auction yard sat adjacent to the train station, which was part of the original design. Cattle came in by rail or on foot, and the buyers came in by rail, and the whole enterprise lived and died on the platform and the yards beside it. The station was busy by the time they arrived, a Tuesday crowd with buyers from 3 counties, and as far as bowsmen, men in good coats standing around the fence rails with their notebooks and their estimating eyes. Wyatt saw Rourke almost immediately. He was standing near the station entrance with 2 men Wyatt didn't know, and Frank Holt, who had apparently decided to come to the auction for reasons that had nothing to do with buying cattle. Rourke was well-dressed, unhurried, with the ease of a man who believes a situation is already settled. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Margaret. He smiled, which was worse than if he hadn't. Margaret saw it. She looked back at Rourke without expression and then looked away, as if he were a fence post, present, noted, unremarkable. They drove the herd into the holding pen, and Wyatt went to register the lot with the auction clerk. Margaret stayed with the animals, moving along the fence rail, checking each one a final time with her eyes, and occasionally her hands, the way she'd been doing every morning for 6 weeks. Pete and Ellis watched the perimeter. Dolan stood at the gate. Vera Sundstrom arrived by wagon from the hotel where she'd stayed the night, with her traveling bag and a smaller bag that held the documents. She found Wyatt at the registration table and stood beside him quietly, and he introduced her to the clerk, who knew her name from the billings agency and looked briefly confused about why she was here. "I'll explain later," Vera said to the clerk. The auction opened at 9. Rourke's herd went first because Rourke had the relationships that determined the order of things. His cattle were good. Nobody was going to pretend otherwise. He had more resources than Wyatt and had been using them, and his herd showed it. The bidding was brisk and settled at a number that reinforced his position in the county's cattle economy. He watched his lot clear with satisfaction and then moved to where he had a clear line of sight to Wyatt's holding pen. When Wyatt's lot was called, the cattle moved into the show yard in the particular way healthy animals move, not performing, just being, which is the only performance that matters to a man spending money on livestock. Buyers moved to the rails. Notebooks came out. Rourke pushed forward through the crowd. "Hold on," he said, loud enough to carry. The auctioneer paused. Rourke had enough standing in that yard that the auctioneer paused. "I think the buyers here deserve some context about this lot," Rourke said. He turned slightly so the crowd could hear him well. "Granger's operation has been struggling for 2 years. This herd was in poor condition as recently as 6 weeks ago. I have men who can attest to that. Whatever you're seeing now is surface. It won't hold through winter." He let that land, then added, as if it were an afterthought, "And the woman managing his operation isn't exactly who she was presented as. She was sent here from a Billings marriage agency, gentlemen. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the judgment involved in staking a cattle operation on someone like that." He said it smoothly, without heat. The way a man says something he's rehearsed until it sounds like he's just thinking out loud. The crowd was not silent, but it got quieter. Buyers exchanged looks, the kind of looks that mean people are uncertain and waiting for something to resolve the uncertainty. Wyatt stepped forward. He opened his mouth. Vera Sundstrom stepped forward first. "My name is Vera Sundstrom," she said, clearly and without hurry. "I worked at the Billings marriage agency for 11 years. I handled the correspondence for this operation. She opened the small bag and removed a folded set of papers. "And I have in my hand written instructions, in language I can read aloud to this crowd if necessary, from a broker working on behalf of Caleb Rourke, directing our agency to send the oldest available female candidate to North Ridge Ranch, specifically because Mr. Rourke believed such a woman would be, quote, useless, and would accelerate the failure of the operation." She said it at a level volume, not shouting, not performing, just saying it the way you say a thing that's true and has been waiting to be said. The crowd went very still. Rourke's face did not change for a moment. Then it changed quite a bit. "That's," he started. "That document is—" "It's signed," Vera said, "by your broker, Mr. Aldis, whose name appears on the canceled supply order that Mr. Granger received from Billings 3 weeks before this auction." She folded the papers back carefully. "I'm happy to let any buyer here examine them." Nobody spoke for a long 4 seconds. Then a buyer from Bozeman, a man named Garrett, who had been in the cattle business for 30 years and had no patience for theater when there was money involved, walked to the fence rail of Wyatt's holding pen and looked at the cattle standing there and said, "I want to see the calves." Wyatt took him to the calves. Garrett looked at them for a while. He put his hand on 2 of them, checking their ribs, their flanks, the condition of their coats. He looked at the older steers. He came back to the rail and opened his notebook. "What's your opening number?" he said to the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked at Rourke once, briefly, and then looked away. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "let's open the bidding." What happened next was not slow. 2 other buyers had moved to the rail before Garrett finished his sentence. A third came from the far side of the yard, a man Wyatt recognized from a Livingston operation who had never bought from him before. The bidding tokens began moving, and they moved in one direction, and it was not toward Caleb Rourke. Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd with Frank Holt and the 2 men from the station entrance. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. The cattle were in the yard. The documents existed. The buyers were spending money. Margaret stood at the far end of the fence rail, both hands resting on the top wire, watching the cattle move in the yard. She was not watching Rourke. She was not watching the crowd. She was watching the animals she had worked on for 6 weeks, the ones that had been struggling and were not struggling anymore, and her face had the expression of a person who is watching something that they helped build function exactly as it was meant to function. Dolan came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just watched alongside her, and that was its own kind of statement. The bidding ran longer than anyone had expected it to. The gavel came down at a number that Wyatt would remember for the rest of his life. Not because it was the largest sum he'd ever heard in an auction yard, but because of what it meant in practical terms. What it closed, what it opened, what it made possible that had not been possible the morning before. He stood at the clerk's table with the paperwork in front of him, and his hand not entirely steady when he signed it, and the clerk, who had been doing this job for 16 years and had seen men cry at auction tables over numbers both good and bad, pretended to be very interested in his inkwell. Garrett from Bozeman came and shook his hand. So did the man from Livingston who had never bought from him before, a rancher named Callum, who had a direct handshake and said simply, "Good cattle." 2 other buyers who had placed bids nodded at him when they passed. None of them said much. Cattle people aren't elaborate with their approval, but they're consistent, and consistency is worth more than elaboration. Rourke was gone from the yard before the gavel fell. Wyatt noticed that. The man had read the room early enough to leave before the number was announced, which was its own kind of information about how he operated. Present for the damage, absent for the accounting. Frank Holt had gone with him, of course. Vera Sundstrom found Wyatt at the clerk's table, and he thanked her, and she said it wasn't his thanks she'd been waiting to give that information. It was just an occasion, and she was glad it had come. She seemed lighter than she had on the wagon ride from the ranch, the way people seem when they've put down something they've been carrying too long. She was taking the afternoon train back to Billings. He walked her to the station entrance, and she shook his hand and left, and that was that. He went to find Margaret. She was still at the fence rail where he'd last seen her, though the holding pen was empty now, the cattle having been claimed by their respective buyers and directed to the rail loading. Dolan was talking to Pete about something at the far end of the rail. Ellis was eating something from a paper sack and watching the platform. Wyatt stood beside Margaret, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment didn't need filling yet. It cleared the debt, he said finally. She nodded. She'd known it would before he said it. She'd been doing the math in her head the same as he had, he suspected, for the last hour. All of it? Everything the bank holds. The supply debt, Henderson's invoice. He paused. And enough left over. She turned to look at him. Enough for what? That's what I wanted to talk to you about. They didn't have the conversation at the auction yard. There were too many people and too much noise, the ordinary aftermath of a big market day. Men loading, horses moving, the station platform filling up with the particular organized chaos of a cattle town in motion. Wyatt bought lunch from the cookhouse that ran off the side of the station building, a practical place that served food to order without making it an occasion, and they ate at a table outside with the mountain air cold enough that the coffee steamed seriously. Dolan ate without talking. Pete and Ellis ate quickly and went to look at something across the yard, which was what young men did when they sensed that a conversation for fewer people was trying to happen. "What did you mean?" Margaret said, setting down her coffee, "by enough left over?" "Enough to repair the south barn properly, enough to buy replacement stock in the spring, younger animals, better bloodlines than what we've been running." He looked at the table. "Enough to make an offer." She was quiet. "Not the kind you think," he said, which was not the most elegant thing he'd ever said, but he'd never been particularly elegant. "I mean a business offer, a partnership offer." She looked at him steadily. "The ranch needs what you know," he said. "Not for 6 weeks, on an ongoing basis. The feeding methods, the rotation, the way you read a sick animal before it gets worse. I've had 3 hands for years, and none of them have what you have, and I say that with full respect to Dolan, who would take my head off if he heard me." He paused. "I want to draw up something proper, a partnership. Your name on the operation. Equal say in decisions about the herd." Margaret was quiet for long enough that Wyatt found himself studying the grain of the table. "You're not doing this because you feel responsible for what Rourke did," she said. "No, because I don't need that. I know you don't." He looked up. "I'm doing it because I watched you pull 2 calves out of brush in the dark, and I watched you rewrite a feeding schedule that I'd been running wrong for 3 years, and I watched 3 grown men who don't respect anything easily start deferring to your judgment without you asking them to." He picked up his coffee. "That's not something you hire. That's something you recognize and act on before you're stupid enough to lose it." Something in her face shifted in that same way it had shifted in the barn, that small opening. She looked out at the station platform, where the afternoon train was beginning to make itself known in the distance, a low sound that was more vibration than noise at first. "I'd need it in writing," she said. "I assumed that. I'd need equal say on major purchases and herd decisions, not advisory, actual equal say." "Yes." She looked back at him. "And I keep my own notes, my own records of what we do and how we do it. Those are mine regardless of how the partnership goes." "That's fair." She nodded once, the way she'd nodded at things since the first morning at the kitchen table. Not a social nod, but a decided one. A nod that meant a conclusion had been reached and the matter was settled. "Then yes," she said. Dolan, who had been staring at his coffee with great focus throughout this exchange, stood up abruptly and took his plate inside, and Wyatt strongly suspected the man was not as uninvested in the outcome as he'd been pretending. The ride back to Northridge was quieter than the ride into town had been, which seemed counterintuitive but made its own sense. The morning had been full of the noise of things that hadn't happened yet. The afternoon had the different quality of things settled. The horses moved at an easy pace, and the mountains sat in their usual position against the western sky, not caring about auctions. Pete rode up alongside Wyatt about halfway back. He was quiet for a while, which was unusual for Pete, who tended to fill his conversational space efficiently. "I heard what you said to her," Pete said. "At the table." Wyatt didn't answer right away. "Dolan told Ellis not to say anything about it," Pete continued, "which means Ellis will say something about it tonight, probably." "Probably. Are you going to tell them officially about the partnership? When we get back?" Pete wrote in silence for another minute. Dolan's going to pretend he didn't already know. Yes, Wyatt said. He will. Set. The conversation with the three hands happened that evening in the barn, which was where conversations of significance tended to happen at North Ridge. Something about the space, the smell of hay and horses, the low light from the hanging lamp that made everything feel serious without being heavy. Wyatt explained it plainly. Margaret was a partner in the operation, effective immediately. He was having the papers drawn up in town. Her authority on ranch decisions was equal to his. He said it the way he'd have said anything operational, directly and without preamble. Dolan looked at the floor. Pete looked at Margaret. Ellis looked at Wyatt, then at Margaret, then back at Wyatt, working through it. So she's not leaving, Ellis said. No, Wyatt said. Ellis looked relieved in the uncomplicated way that young men who haven't yet learned to hide their reactions look relieved. Good, he said. The calves are doing better. I didn't want that to stop. Dolan finally looked up. His face was doing the thing it did when he had an opinion he was deciding whether to express. He looked at Margaret, and then at Wyatt, and then back at Margaret. I got 2 questions, he said. All right, Margaret said. The calf with the bad teeth. What do we do with it long term? We continue the supplemental feeding through winter and see how the molars develop. If they don't come in right by spring, we make a different decision then. She paused. What's the second question? Dolan looked at the ground again briefly. The east pasture, the rotation you've got it on, does that run through winter, or do we pull back? We pull back, she said. Let it rest under the snow. Open it again in early April. Dolan nodded. Once. The kind of nod that meant he'd been waiting for someone to give that answer and was satisfied it was the right one. Okay, he said, and went back to the horses. Pete said, welcome, I guess, to Margaret, with a somewhat awkward smile that she received with a straight face and a small nod that managed to communicate genuine appreciation without making it awkward. Ellis said, do you want me to move your trunk to the main room? There's more space there. Then he appeared to realize that might have implied something he hadn't intended, turned red, and immediately left the barn. Margaret looked at Wyatt. They're yours, he said. They're good men, she said. Dolan especially. He just needed someone to trust. He'd argue about that. He can argue all he wants, she said. It's still true. The news of what had happened at the auction moved through Big Timber the way news moves through small towns, which is to say faster than any reasonable person would expect, and with certain elaborations that had not occurred in the original version. By Thursday, most of the county had heard that Caleb Rourke had been publicly revealed as the architect of a deliberate scheme against a small rancher, and that a woman he'd specifically chosen to be useless had turned out to be the reason the herd sold above market estimate, and that documented evidence of his instructions existed and had been read aloud to a crowd of cattle buyers. The elaborations included a version where Wyatt had said something dramatic to Rourke's face that he had not actually said, and a version where the bidding had gone significantly higher than it had, and a version where Vera Sundstrom had produced the documents from a locked box, which was not true, but added a satisfying detail to the story. What was not an elaboration was the effect on Rourke's business relationships. The first sign was the merchant on the main street who'd been quietly extending Rourke preferential terms on certain supplies for years. He sent Rourke a letter that week. Wyatt only knew about this because Calloway mentioned it with a particular look on his face, indicating that the terms would be changing to standard market rate. The merchant didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The timing was self-explanatory. The second sign was Garrett from Bozeman, who Wyatt heard through the cattle circuit had declined a standing arrangement with Rourke's operation for the following spring in favor of exploring other sources. The third sign was Aldous, the broker. Calloway told Wyatt about this one 2 weeks after the auction when Wyatt came to town to file the partnership papers. Aldous had left Billings for reasons that were not publicly stated. Whether Rourke had cut him loose as a liability, or whether Aldous had decided the association was no longer worth its risks, depended on who you asked. Rourke himself remained in the county. He wasn't ruined. A man with his resources doesn't ruin easily, and Wyatt was not naive enough to believe otherwise. But he was diminished, and diminishment to a man like Rourke was its own particular punishment, because he had built everything on the appearance of inevitability, on people believing he was the kind of force that couldn't be opposed. That appearance had taken a public wound, and wounds to appearances don't close easily. Wyatt filed the partnership papers on a Thursday morning. The clerk who processed them was a different clerk from the one at the auction, a woman named Helen who had been handling the county's legal paperwork for years and who read the document with professional blankness and then looked up at Wyatt and at Margaret, who had come with him, and said, "Both signatures here." They signed. Helen stamped it. She gave them each a copy. Outside on the boardwalk, Margaret folded her copy and put it inside her coat. She did it carefully, the way you put something away that you intend to keep. "It's real now," Wyatt said. "It was real before the paper," she said. "The paper is for other people." He almost argued with that. He didn't, because she wasn't wrong. They walked back to where the wagon was tied. The street was busy with the ordinary business of a Thursday in October. People going in and out of the dry goods store, a boy from the telegraph office running somewhere, 2 women from the church auxiliary standing on the corner talking. One of them looked at Margaret and then looked away. The other one, older, someone Wyatt recognized as having been on the platform the day Margaret arrived, looked at Margaret for a moment and then nodded. Not effusively, just nodded. The way you acknowledge someone you've reassessed. Margaret nodded back with the same economy and kept walking. In the wagon heading north, she said, "I need to write to my sister in Wyoming. I told her I'd let her know what happened." "What did you tell her before you left?" "I told her I was going to look at a ranch and see if it was worth staying." She looked at the road ahead. "She told me I was being foolish." "What are you going to say to her now?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, and the wagon moved through the yellowed grass and the cold air and the mountains that didn't change regardless of what happened in the valley below them. "I'll tell her she was right that I was being foolish," she said, "and that it worked out anyway." Wyatt drove the wagon and said nothing, which was sometimes the best possible response. Chat. The first hard freeze came in early November, 3 weeks after the auction. It came in overnight the way real cold comes, Guam. Without much announcement, just a drop and then a harder drop and then morning arriving with the ground solid and the water trough iced over and the breath of cattle visible in white clouds at the fence rail. Wyatt was out before first light to break the ice on the trough and check the south side of the pasture where the ground tended to heave. Margaret was already there. She had broken most of the ice herself with the long-handled tool from the barn, and she was checking the fence posts along the south run with the same systematic attention she'd used that first evening when she walked out alone to look at the herd. Her coat was the same one she'd arrived in. It was a good coat, but it was not a Montana winter coat, and he filed that away. "Post at the corner held," she said without turning around. "Good. The ones along the creek might want checking by afternoon. The ground under them was soft before the freeze." "I'll send Pete." She finished with the fence and turned around. Her face was red from the cold in a way that people's faces are when they haven't been paying attention to whether they're cold because they've been paying attention to the work. She pulled her coat tighter. "You need a better coat," he said. She looked down at the one she was wearing. "This is a perfectly good coat." "It's a good coat for Wyoming. Montana's different." She looked up at him with an expression that was not quite arguing and not quite conceding. "I'll look at what they have at the dry goods store next time I'm in town. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Alderholt, who makes them. I'll have her send out what she has in stock." "That's not necessary." "No," he agreed. "It's just practical." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the herd, which was moving in its morning way, slow and purposeful and indifferent to human decisions about coat procurement. "The calves came through the night well," she said. They did. "The rotation through the east pasture is going to matter this winter. Having that grass rested is going to give us—" She paused, corrected herself without being asked. "Going to give the herd better footing going into the cold months." Wyatt heard the correction. He didn't comment on it, but he heard it. He went to break the remaining ice at the far trough, and when he came back, she was still at the fence rail, hands resting on the top wire, watching the cattle with the same patient attention she'd given them since the first evening she walked out alone in the dark to see what she'd gotten herself into. He thought about the tag in his coat pocket. He'd transferred it from coat to coat without throwing it away, which was something he hadn't examined closely. He knew it was still there. He knew what he was going to do with it eventually, though that was a thought for a different day. For now there was the herd to manage and the winter to prepare for, and a south fence that needed Pete's attention by afternoon, and a partnership that had its name on paper and its weight in the daily work of a ranch that was, for the first time in 2 years, moving in the right direction. The cold settled in around them. The cattle breathed their visible breath into the morning air. Somewhere on the road, a wagon moved through the valley, heading somewhere ordinary, and the mountains held their position against the sky as they always had and always would, waiting for nothing and owing nothing, and standing as the fixed point against which everything else measured its distance. The winter that year was not kind, but it was honest. Honest winters were something Margaret had come to respect over 22 years in Wyoming. Not the ones that pretended to ease up and then came back harder, not the false thaws that rotted the fence posts and flooded the low pastures before the real cold returned, but the kind that announced themselves plainly and stayed until they were finished. This Montana winter was that kind. It came in November, and it did not pretend otherwise, and in its consistency there was something almost reliable. The coat from Mrs. Alderholt arrived the second week of November. It was heavy wool, dark brown, lined with something that held warmth the way good insulation holds warmth, not by being decorative about it, but by simply working. Margaret put it on and went back out to check the creek fence without commenting on it, and Wyatt watched from the barn doorway and said nothing either, because they had arrived at the particular understanding that exists between people who have decided to be practical about everything, including care. The herd moved through the first month of winter better than Wyatt had seen in 3 years. The east pasture rest was paying back what it had been given. The grass underneath the snow was recovering rather than exhausted. And when the animals were rotated through the sections Margaret had mapped out in October, they were finding feed that hadn't been stripped to the root. Small thing, in isolation, compounded across a winter, not small at all. Ellis figured out the supplemental feeding for the molar calf on his own, which surprised everyone, including Ellis. He adjusted the grain mixture one morning based on something he'd watched Margaret do the week before and came to find her afterward to ask if he'd done it right. She went and looked and told him yes, that was correct, and he went back to work with the expression of a person who has discovered they are more capable than they knew. That kind of discovery doesn't announce itself. It just quietly changes how a person carries themselves. Dolan, by December, had stopped pretending he hadn't adopted Margaret's rotation system as his own operating principle. He referred to it in conversations with Pete as the way we do it, which was the highest possible integration into Dolan's worldview. The moment a new thing stopped being new and became simply the way things were. The letter from Margaret's sister arrived in December, 3 weeks after Margaret had written to her. Her sister's name was Ruth, and she was 4 years older and had strong opinions about most things, which Margaret had mentioned once in passing and which Wyatt had filed away as useful context. The letter was 2 pages in Ruth's handwriting, which Margaret described as aggressive, and its contents could be summarized, though Margaret didn't summarize them at the kitchen table. She read the relevant portions aloud with the flat delivery of someone sharing absurdity rather than hurt. Ruth had concerns. Ruth had specifically concerns about the legitimacy of the arrangement, about the wisdom of an unmarried woman entering a business partnership with a man she'd met 2 months ago, about what people in Wyoming would think, and about whether Margaret had considered what she would do when this ranching adventure concluded. Margaret finished reading and folded the letter and put it beside her coffee. "What are you going to tell her?" Wyatt asked. "I'm going to tell her the partnership is filed with the county, the herd came through the first hard freeze better than projected, and that what people in Wyoming think has not historically been a significant factor in my decision-making." She picked up her coffee. "And that this adventure, as she calls it, has a name on the gate." Wyatt looked at her. "It doesn't yet." She looked back. "No, it doesn't yet." There was a pause that was not quite awkward and not quite comfortable, sitting somewhere between the two. "What would you put on it?" he asked. She thought about it with the same honest deliberation she gave everything. "Granger and Ellison," she said. Alphabetical would put Ellison first, but that seems like a fight not worth having. "Granger and Ellison," he repeated, "unless you have a different preference." "No," he said. "That's right." She nodded and went back to her letter, and Wyatt went back to the account books. And outside, the snow came down in the particular quiet way snow comes down when it intends to stay. The sign went up in March, when the worst of the winter had broken enough to work outside without the cold making every task twice as long. Pete made it. He had a steadier hand than anyone expected, which was a thing nobody had known until Margaret asked if anyone could do the lettering, and Pete said he thought he could manage it. He could more than manage it. The sign was clean, dark-stained wood with the letters burned in evenly. North Ridge Ranch, Granger and Ellison. Wyatt and Dolan set the post. Margaret and Ellis held the sign level while they worked. Pete stood back and observed his own work, with the critical eye of a person who knows what they were trying to do and is checking whether they achieved it. "It's straight," Ellis said. "The E in Ellison is slightly wide," Pete said. "Nobody's going to notice that," Ellis said. "I'll notice it." "Then don't look at the E," Ellis said, which was not helpful, but was not wrong either. Margaret looked at the sign for a long moment from the road, the way you look at something that represents a shift in what's real, not sentimental about it, just taking it in. "It's good," she said to Pete, and Pete accepted that with a nod that he tried to make casual and didn't quite succeed. Spring brought new calves and new problems, which is what spring always brings on a working ranch. And the problems that year were the ordinary kind. A difficult birth in April that cost them one calf but not the cow. A section of the north fence that heaved worse than expected when the ground thawed. A late cold snap in May that required 2 nights of close watching on the younger animals. Hard things, all of them, but not the kind of hard that came with someone's hand behind it, just the land being the land. Rourke had, by spring, become a peripheral figure in the valley's cattle economy in the way that men become peripheral when their reputation for inevitability is gone. He was still present, he still had money and land, but the particular gravity he'd carried, the sense that dealing with him was necessary, that his approval was a resource worth securing, that was diminished in ways that didn't reverse. Some losses are like that. They don't announce themselves as permanent. They just quietly become so. Calloway told Wyatt in April that Aldous had surfaced in Miles City running a small trading operation, and that 2 ranchers who'd been under Rourke's thumb for years had renegotiated their supply arrangements. Nobody had done anything dramatic. The county had simply recalibrated, the way things recalibrate when the weight that was holding them off balance is removed. Wyatt didn't spend much time thinking about Rourke. There was too much actual work for that, which was itself a kind of resolution. The frame tag was Margaret's idea, and it came about in a way that was entirely characteristic of how she came to decisions, practically without sentimentality, but with a clear understanding of what a thing meant. She found it in his coat pocket in May, when she was helping him sort through gear before storing the winter coats until fall. She held it up, the brown paper square, folded once, the word worthless in its clean block letters, and looked at it. "You kept this," she said. "Yes." She turned it over. The back was blank. "Why?" He thought about that. "I wasn't sure at first. Then I figured a thing like that ought to be looked at, not thrown away where you can't see it." She held it a moment longer. Then she said, "I want to frame it." He wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Frame it. Not to dwell on it. Not as... She paused, working out how to say it. Not as a wound, as a record. A person ought to know what someone thought of them at the beginning and what the same situation looks like at the end. She turned the tag over in her hands again. He wrote this because he thought it was true. The fact that it wasn't true isn't something I need to be ashamed of. It's something I'd like to be able to look at. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. "Beside the mortgage," she said. "When it's paid." He nodded slowly. "When it's paid." What? The mortgage was paid in full in September, 14 months after the auction. The October cattle sales saw Northridge's first full season under the partnership came in above the previous year's numbers, which had already been the best Wyatt had seen in 3 years. Margaret had expanded the rotation system, introduced bloodline documentation for the calves that made subsequent sales significantly more straightforward, and begun a practice of what she called winter accounting, detailed records of what each animal cost to carry through a Montana winter versus what it returned at market, that gave them a clearer picture of the herd's actual economics than Wyatt had ever had before. The numbers were not magic. They were the result of someone knowing what they were doing and doing it with consistency. That was all. But that, it turned out, was enough. The day the bank sent the paid-in-full documentation, Wyatt rode into town and came back with a frame, plain wood, the right size for a small piece of paper, and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Margaret was at the table with her records. She looked at the frame. She looked at him. "You remembered," she said. "You said beside the mortgage when it's paid." He set the paid documentation next to the frame. "It's paid." She picked up the tag and looked at it one more time. She had looked at it a few times over the past months, he knew, though she never made a production of it. Just looked at it the way you look at a thing you're deciding how to carry. She put it in the frame. Wyatt had a small nail and a hammer, and he hung both frames side by side on the wall of the main room, beside the window that faced east, where the morning light would find them first. Margaret stood back and looked at them. The paid mortgage. The word worthless in block letters behind glass. "Accurate," she said, which was not what he'd expected her to say. He looked at her. "The frame makes it accurate," she said. "It's a historical document now. This is what someone believed in September of last year. The mortgage is what was true by the following September." She paused. "That's not a sad story. That's a complete one. Tut. The ranchers started coming in the second year. Word traveled the way it travels in cattle country, through buyers at auction, through hands who moved between operations, through the practical network of men who paid attention to which outfits were consistently producing healthy animals. A rancher from Livingston came first, in the spring of the second year, wanting to understand the rotation system. Margaret spent 2 hours with him at the fence rail and gave him her notes on the East pasture recovery. He went home and applied it, and the following year sent a letter saying the results had been what she'd described. After him came 2 men from an operation near White Sulphur Springs, then a younger rancher from up near Harlowton who had just inherited his family's struggling outfit and heard that someone at North Ridge had turned a bad situation around and wanted to know how. Margaret talked to all of them. She didn't make it a service or an enterprise. She just talked to them the way she talked to anyone with a genuine question, directly, without flattery, and with the honest acknowledgement that what had worked at North Ridge had worked in North Ridge's specific conditions, and that conditions varied and they'd need to observe their own land before applying anyone else's methods wholesale. The young rancher from Harlowton, his name was Dale, he was 28 and visibly nervous about whether he was going to lose the family land, sat at the kitchen table for an afternoon and asked questions that were sometimes the right questions and sometimes not, which was the right ratio for someone new to a problem. Margaret answered all of them. Dolan brought coffee without being asked, which was not nothing. When Dale left, he shook Wyatt's hand and then Margaret's, and he said, "I didn't expect," and then stopped, trying to find the end of that sentence. "What?" Margaret asked. He looked slightly embarrassed. "I didn't expect the person everyone was talking about to be—" He stopped again. "To be what?" Her voice was not sharp, just direct. "I heard the woman at North Ridge," he said. "I didn't know what I was expecting. Someone younger, I think." He said it honestly, not as an insult, but as an admission of his own prior stupidity. "I'm sorry. That was a dumb thing to expect." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "How old are you?" she said. 28. "Ask me that question again in 30 years, she said, "about whether younger is better. See what you think then." Dale laughed, a little surprised by it. He got on his horse and rode north. He came back 2 years later with better questions. "Well, there's a thing that happens to people who have been written off. Not all of them, because being written off breaks some people, and that is its own truth. But to some of them, they develop a particular quality of certainty that is different from confidence. Confidence can be faked. This other thing cannot. It comes from having been told you are not worth anything, and having continued anyway, and having arrived somewhere real, and the arriving is not the point. The continuing is the point. The arriving is just evidence. Margaret Ellison had that quality. She'd had some version of it before she stepped off the train in Big Timber. You don't get through 22 hard years without some of it forming, but the year at North Ridge had finished the work. She knew what she knew. She knew what she'd done with what she knew. No one's opinion of either thing was particularly relevant to her anymore, not because she'd stopped caring what people thought, but because she'd stopped needing their thinking to tell her what was real. That is not a comfortable quality to be around for people who need others to be uncertain. But for people who are trying to do actual work in difficult conditions, it is exactly the quality you want nearby. Wyatt understood this. He understood it in the particular way that people understand things that have changed their lives. Not as a lesson, exactly, but as a fact so embedded in daily experience that it stops being separable from the experience itself. He had been a man drowning in increments when she arrived. Not dramatically, just slowly, the way a ranch dies when bad luck and a determined enemy overlap with insufficient resources, and a man who is too tired to see all three clearly. She had seen clearly, and she had worked, which was not a romantic thing or a poetic thing. It was a practical thing, the most practical thing, and its results were practical too. The herd in the second autumn was the best North Ridge had put to market in its 11-year history. Margaret wrote that in her records without embellishment, the same way she wrote everything, as a fact that deserved to stand without decoration. On a morning in late October, 2 autumns after she'd arrived, Margaret walked out to the road in front of the ranch house before the light was fully up. She did this sometimes, in the early mornings when the work could wait 20 minutes and the valley was quiet, and the train could be heard from Big Timber carrying its load of whoever was coming and whoever was going. The sign at the gate caught the early light. North Ridge Ranch. Granger and Ellison. The lettering still clean, Pete's slightly wide E still there if you were looking for it. Wyatt came out of the barn and saw her standing at the road. He walked up and stood beside her without asking why she was there. They could hear the train from where they stood. Not see it yet. Just hear it, that low sound that was more feeling than noise, moving through the valley below the mountains in the ordinary way it moved every morning regardless of who was on it, or what they were bringing with them, or what they believed about where they were going. "Someone's stepping off that train right now," Margaret said, "thinking they know how this is going to go." Wyatt looked down the valley. "They usually don't." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "But that's not the tragedy people make it out to be, not knowing how things will go." She watched the distant tree line where the rail cut through. "I stepped off a train with 1 trunk and $42 and a freight tag that told me what I was worth, and the man who sent me here thought he knew exactly how it would go." She paused. He was wrong about the tag. He was wrong about the woman. He was wrong about the ranch. She turned and looked at the sign. 3 things he got wrong, and he was so certain he got them right. Wyatt said nothing. He was thinking about September of last year, and October, and November, and the freeze, and the auction, and a woman pulling 2 calves out of brush in the dark, with the patience of someone who has learned that most things require more patience than you brought with you. "The tag was never about you," he said. She looked at him. "It was about what he needed to believe," he said, "to keep believing the valley worked the way he wanted it to work. The tag was for him, not for you." She considered that. "That's generous?" "It's accurate." She looked at the sign again, then at the mountains, then at the gate where the road turned from public to theirs. "I'm going to check the south fence this morning," she said. "The ground's been soft near the creek again. I'll send Ellis. I'll go myself. I want to look at the calf weights before I come back." She walked back toward the barn. Wyatt stood at the road another moment, listening to the train that had already passed and whose sound was fading south through the valley, leaving behind the ordinary silence of a Montana morning, the wind off the ridge, the distant cattle, the creak of the sign in the cold air moving back and forth by a degree or two, steadily, the way things hold that are set in the ground deep enough to last. He went back to work. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, not because everything had been resolved without remainder, or because the hard years had been erased by the good ones, or because cruelty always produces its own correction. It doesn't, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But because two people had each taken what they knew and put it to use on ground that needed it, and the ground had responded, and the herd had responded, and the three men who worked that land had responded, and the county had watched and drawn its own conclusions, and the mountains had continued not caring about any of it, which was their right and perhaps their function. The sign at the gate meant what it said. 2 names, 1 ranch, the richest herd in that part of Montana, which was not a boast but a measurement, the kind that shows up in records and in the condition of animals, and in the faces of young ranchers who ride 4 hours to sit at a kitchen table and ask questions and ride home with something they didn't have before. The faded tag in its frame on the wall meant what it said too. Every visitor who came to North Ridge after that saw it, and most of them asked about it, and the answer was always the same and always short. That's what someone thought once. That's what happened after. The two things together told the whole story, and the whole story was this: that a person's value is not determined in the 30 seconds it takes for a train to stop and someone to step off it, and that the people most certain of their ability to assess worth at a glance are most often the ones who understand it least, and that the work itself, steady, unglamorous, consistent, present, is what answers every claim about what a person is or isn't worth. And it answers in the only language that cannot be argued with, which is the language of what actually happened. What actually happened was North Ridge. What actually happened was Margaret Ellison, who arrived with 1 trunk and stayed.